Blog Talk Radio.
And we're live. This is Cloak and Swagger podcast, our third or fourth on the new platform. This is Ali, also known as Packetknife, and hopefully I will be joined here shortly by our illustrious co-host Scott, better known as Cryptia. But we already have on the line both Conrad Constantine of Alienvault. I will say of Alienvault fame at this point because he's been a riot this past year, and a lot more people know about him now than I remember the year before that. And we also have Jack Whitsitt he is in the energy sector working with his government peers, and he has been in the government sector for a while now. So I'm going to hand it over to those two. I'll hand it to Jack first to give a little bit of background about himself before we dive into the Cyber Executive Order. Jack?
Thanks, Ali. So you're right. Currently, I'm in the energy sector space. I work for a nonprofit called Energy Sec.
We got guys. We got somebody. Are one of you playing the podcast live in the background? There we go. It's gone. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm getting a ton of.
Guys, we got somebody. Are one of you playing the podcast live in the background? There we go. Go ahead. It's repeating. Somebody, Conrad, do you have the podcast on?
Nah, you're actually on headset here anyway, so.
And Jack, you don't have it on.
1 second.
Nah, you're actually on headset.
That's better. Are we good?
There we go. All right, so we'll go right back to Jack if you want to do an introduction here.
Sure. I'm currently working for Energy Sec, a nonprofit in the electric sector space. We focus on building community-level information sharing with the electric sector companies, particularly focusing on those kind of non-regulated entities in the electric sector. We also, basically try and support the sector in whatever it needs in a number of different areas for improving their cybersecurity posture. Probably more pertinent to this conversation at the moment is I just came out of a few months ago the Transportation Security Administration. As opposed to the airport functions that they serve, they're also the sector-specific agency for transportation. What that means is that we worked in helping the private industry within transportation to improve their cybersecurity posture from a federal perspective. Within this conversation, the sector-specific agencies are basically the points of contact. They're one of the primary coordinating functions for public-private partnerships for government and industry in cybersecurity. Prior to that, I was in the ICS CERT, working for Idaho National Labs. I've built MSSPs, done open source development work, etc.
All right, excellent. And the exact opposite of the spectrum, I think, purely private sector at the upper echelons is Conrad. So, Conrad, do you want to give background there?
Well, as you were saying, I've managed to get a lot more put out the last year because the previous couple of years I worked for a very, very large company in the storage business who were super paranoid about any of their security people even identifying they worked for them. And the last year or so with Alienvault, I've been kind of free of those corporate shackles to get out and pimp myself a little more. In fact, they've been encouraging me to do it at every turn, so be careful what you wish for. But before that, I've probably been doing this for about 20 years on and off, mostly telecom, ISP. That was pretty much my start back in the 90s and everything. Bit of consulting in the middle of the last decade, and then our previous unnamed employer that ran into a bit of an event that made national news and gave me a little bit of face time with some of the people we'll be talking about tonight. Definitely. Other than that, Python programmer, Amiga nostalgia guy, and as you probably noticed, British dude. Try not to hold it against me.
You lived in New Zealand, too, for a while, right?
I did. And there are still people that can use calling me a New Zealander as an insult quite effectively.
So, and I just want to frame this and why I like this pairing is that Jack is, from my perspective, as long as I've known him, he's one of the best level-headed guys on the government's work in this area. He's not bombastic. He's definitely not, a China. He's very real about what can and can't be done. He doesn't overestimate or underestimate the technical threats. He's definitely an insider, and that's kind of the world I came out of a few years ago now. Conrad's an outsider to that world, but probably in his current position has access to one of the largest data sets of open information and is one of those pivot companies in Alienvault that gets threat information from all over the place, all over the world, including China and the U.S. So I like having these two paired on here. And what I was hoping to do is actually open up with Conrad, because Jack's written, and I posted the links on the description of the podcast, a couple of FAQs, mini and full FAQs now. And I wanted to open up to Conrad his perception of the cyber executive order, his perception of customers that come to him and Alienvault and saying, what does this mean to us, and what his feelings about it are, and then kind of let the two of them go back and forth on addressing this. I'll interject or stir the pot as we go along. So, Conrad, if you could kind of get us started on your perspective, that would be great.
Yeah, let me give you a bit of a history lesson, I guess. As recently as 10 years ago, there was the government and the defense sector, and there was the private world. And for those of us in InfoSec, we were both aware of each other. We hung out we hung out in Vegas together, but they were definitely very separate areas. And there was a mutual respect. We knew there were things we couldn't talk to each other about, and it was good. And I think the last decade with, should we just say, the general, resurgence of militarization in regular politics outside of our world has kind of transformed things into this ever-encroaching control of all things security by the government and defense sector, and there's a lot of toe-stepping going on right now. This is just another step in that, and I think my general thoughts are that the whole executive order is possibly going to be this measure of a watershed for how this is going to play out long term in terms of ownership of this issue, be it private or public sector, and for what it means for us who've been working in InfoSec all this time. I think a lot of it, what it means for us career-wise. I mean, I've never wanted a security clearance, and happily, I've never been eligible for one either. Certainly, I think there was a good period of time, I think, around about 2002, 2004, where such the greater part of InfoSec jobs out there must have a security clearance, just out of sheer paranoia. I think half the time that I actually took a break from InfoSec for a while and ended up doing more telecom stuff and everything. That finally leveled out, I think, around 2006ish. And now the needle seems to be swinging back in that direction again and everything. And there's a disturbing culture attached to that as well. I think I think me and Scott have both riffed on about the rise of secret squirrels, wannabe secret agents, and how there's a lot of difference between an analyst and an operative. So,
absolutely, and I'm more on your side of the fence now going through that. So, Jack, do you have any immediate responses to that? Because you you really feel that the executive order is completely misunderstood.
And to a large degree, I think it is. One of the things I just heard, which is, it was very InfoSec focused, what I just heard. What the problem ends up being is that the federal government has had, obviously, it's the federal government, a long-standing relationship with private industry when it comes to all hazards. So, you're talking about relationships with the train companies, with reducing crime, with reducing terrorism, with, I hate that word, but even prior to the silly, to terrorism took on such a gargantuanly disproportionate role in the dialogue, you have federal government involved in safety, in security, basically throughout history. So as you start getting directives like Presidential Directives HS-87, that start saying, once CHS is created, you have a responsibility specifically in one agency to take all of the, and the term the government uses would be all hazards, to take all the all hazards risk reduction upon yourselves to begin to work through. So the stuff that all of the different federal agencies were already on the hook to be doing in the past starts to begin to focus under DHS. That includes natural disasters, that includes crime, that includes terrorism, that includes all sorts of things. Cybersecurity is one of those hazards, a hazard being something that can negatively impact national interests. And so while in the past, the InfoSec community was standalone, as the potential impact of cybersecurity issues started to reach to a level of national consequence that not only was national in scale, but also began to surpass the local interests of CIOs, of CISOs, and individual organizations, there are many concerns with cybersecurity at a national level that just aren't necessarily something a C-level executive at one organization by default cares about. And so whether anybody likes it or not, I don't think anybody's really happy with it, you start to see a convergence of interest, especially under the all hazards approach. And when you start combining, hey, InfoSec, we've been alone, we've done our own thing, with the long-term dialogue that's already been happening between the private sector and government when it comes to risk reduction, you start to get into some interesting conflicting perspectives, realities, and mission spaces. So I think one of the things the executive order is attempting to do is to work through and evolve what that means when it comes to cybersecurity, to take some of the lessons learned from the past few years and begin to, if not completely, start to sort out what's what as these two different perspectives have kind of crashed into each other over the past few years.
And that's that perspective thing is really kind of the I think the key of the stuff that's worth discussing from our end. I think you're totally right. It is. It's as the reach of influence extends, government inevitably becomes part of it. That per se is not a bad thing on its own. If anything, hey, look, there is the recognition of the importance of information security we've been crying out for 20 years. But once again, be careful what you wish for, you may get it. It's just how that transition happens that's perhaps the crucial thing for us to really take control of at this point.
Yeah, let me actually respond to that because I agree with you completely. Despite all the differing perspectives, one of my personal points of view on this is that there's a crashing set of perspectives from not just a government industry standpoint, but from a tactical, technologically focused InfoSec community with the need to change the strategic relationship at a business level, at an industry level that goes on. So, and this isn't. There's a lot of smart people who focus on the whole big picture in InfoSec, but the average perspective is very, very, in my opinion, focused on operations. How do we share specific information? How do we combat specific threats? What are the et cetera? How do we build an InfoSec organization within our larger organization? There's when in my opinion, the government began to build its cybersecurity capabilities, it unfortunately focused at a much, much more tactical level. You start to get the certs built. You start to get they look at it from a standards and a regulatory perspective, which set of controls, like, the SIP standards and energy. They're very, very, very focused on the technology. And I think what you're seeing with the executive order is a rethinking of that approach. As people get more educated, as the people who are writing these policies, as the dialogue matures, now that we've included this whole huge number of people who never had to deal with information security before, all the guards, gates, guns people, they just had no idea what they were talking about, to be honest, and had a very, very physical reality perspective. As their awareness has matured, as the people who participated in the process has matured, you're starting to see a shift from the government coming and going, you know what, I don't know why you guys aren't doing this, let's just regulate you and let's just put in a whole bunch of technical controls in place or process controls or whatever, to a much more dynamic, realistic, business-driven perspective of, okay, let's actually figure out what the problems are. Let's solve this as a problem instead of just assuming there's a best practice out there somewhere that could just be slapped on it. To summarize, I think you're seeing an awareness shift of the complexity, the subtlety, and the breadth of what information security at a national level really means, and that's slowly seeping into the dialogue, and it just wasn't there before.
Yeah, something that I do that tech can't. Tech doesn't address things driven by people. It's about time that shift happened.
I'm interested in. I like Jack's perspective on this. Now, my problem with it, and we've had this discussion on Twitter and via some blog posts, is that I think his perspective is very unique, and that's part of what I want to hear from Jack. Is his perspective very unique? Has the government really adopted a broader outlook? Because what happens is a lot of other people go out there as liaisons from the government in various sectors. And for years now, in my case since about mid-2004, they've gone out and they've said, we're going to be doing something next year. And it's been next year since 2004 up until pretty much executive order. Because every other little standard or every other contract management gap that was filled was so vague as to continue to make it next year. And what happened in my circles are that companies in mid-2004 were saying, we need to get our cyber game up to speed because it will be a competitive advantage. But by 2007, the companies were saying, you know what, we're not going to do anything else until the government tells us what we have to do because we're worried about losing contracts, we're worried about spending too much money, we're being locked out of meetings. And it just got really ugly. And as late as this morning, I had somebody who is in defense circles, in one of the biggest defense contractors out there, say that their C-level was told again that we'll have follow-up meetings on what you need to do in regards to the executive order. And based on what Jack's saying, really there is nothing for us to do. In these blog posts, there is nothing for us to do right now as a private industry for the executive order, but that message isn't being communicated that way.
I can start responding to that. First, there's my ex actually had she's from Finland. She had a great saying. It doesn't translate very well to English, but the saying is don't expect with a ladle from that which was given with a spoon. The point being that if you're expecting perfection out of this, not just perfection, but even large scale visible change where everybody's absolutely on board, you're not going to see it. The government just doesn't move that fast. It can't. So on one hand, I'm going to agree with you and say you're right. The message doesn't get through. But what I will say is that the dialogue I've had over the past year with a number of the people who are involved, a number of people who are promoting the message, who are working on the message, and who are advocating some of this change that turned ultimately into the executive order, has been the right people are now being paid attention to. The right conversations are now being had. So it might not be the end of the line to say, hey, this is really good stuff, but it was so scary, the kind of conversations that were going on before, because it was so heavily tactically focused.
You've actually just kind of answered what was going to be my next question, which was, never mind making things better. Is this an end to just not making things worse?
It's a rethinking of the approach, in my opinion. Before, what happened is you have the all hazards approach, and then somebody stuck the word cyber here and there into the policies, right? Now there's we've learned a little bit about that. Let's, instead of just kind of arbitrarily sticking cyber in there, making people figure it out, there's a little bit more thought about what cybersecurity, what the holistic view of cybersecurity should be from solving the problem. There's so many people who just think, if we just, that all cybersecurity is a bunch of people with controls, that if you just did the right best practices, if you just shared information, everything would be peachy. There's also a lot of people who don't understand what high-level enterprise architecture looks like. There's so much similarity between what the executive order framework is proposing and what a real high-level, non-mandatory enterprise security architecture for the nation would look like, that it's impressive. And the second part of the statement is the executive order doesn't actually direct the private sector to do anything, and that's true. However, what it directs the government to do is say, hey, industry, we can't do this. You are the owners of your information, you're the owners of your priorities, you're the owners of the directions, and you are the thought leaders in this space. Will you please come to the table with us and figure this out? So the purpose of the executive order is to straighten out the federal government. The message to the federal government is to engage the private sector, to have them figure it out. One of the direct messages we got from NIST, in one of the public meetings they had directly after the executive order response was, this isn't a typical NIST standard that's being proposed. It's not a typical NIST effort. The role of NIST in this engagement is to engage people and to engage industry and to collect information, not to make necessarily determinations. And so that's something that's a little bit of a change. And also it's hopefully it's a re-emphasis on partnership. We've had, and this is going to be on industries as much as this is going to be on everybody, honestly, which is, it's been tough to get industry to actually engage in the dialogue. It's not like nothing's been happening. It's not like government's been moving without industry involvement. It's the government screwed it up, industry screwed it up, the media screwed it up, and honestly, they just haven't been talking very well for the past 2 years. So, again, going back to your question, there's no direct action for industry, but there is direction to the government to get industry involved in this conversation, and to because honestly, they're the owners of the information, they're the owners of the risk, and they're the owners of the priorities and how this is all going to fall out. So the government is, in my opinion, and not everybody has this message, not everybody's been raised to the appropriate level of awareness that they need to be, and that's just a thing that happens over time. But the message is that, we need the government's role is to facilitate a better solution to this. And if they cannot facilitate a better resolution to this, then there has to be regulation. One of the shifts in the conversation has been from, hey, industry isn't doing anything, to this is just so important. Everybody either needs to participate or we need to regulate. That's a subtle but important shift in perception.
So you basically what I'm hearing is that there's very specifically an attitude change attached to this. And in terms of when the government sends people out on site, they are sending them out with a different attitude prepared. I'm leading up here and everything, but
sure.
Essentially that idea of, my experiences with federal involvement in this kind of stuff has been very much, we're from the government, we're here to help, we know everything, you're idiots, get out of our way, your input is not important. If your input was important, you would have a badge and clearance like us.
Exactly, and I want to, before Jack gets in on that response, I want to add a little bit of salt to that, because right now, I tell people that if you're going to pay attention to one thing, it's anything but the government right now, because we're just not at that point where the government is adding a substantial amount of value to the conversation. I think it's anything but. And to Conrad's point earlier, have they shifted to try not to make it worse? And based on, the news cycle with a lot of it surrounding Mandiant recently, I'm not sure if they've made that shift yet. The EO may be the first step in making that shift, but I'm not sure they made that shift yet, because they definitely do go into places and they slap a clearance down, they slap government requirements down on it, and what will happen quite often, and this is exactly what happened to me and a number of my peers at the organization I was with a few years back, was all of a sudden things that we knew were now considered classified. And we got these strange instructions that we just weren't allowed to talk about it the same way anymore. These were things we already knew, and it was extremely painful to try to go back to infrastructure folks and programmers and C-levels who weren't cleared and folks, and then the process of going to try to get other folks cleared, and the process of getting information that we passed the government ourselves that would come back out of the government as classified or restricted or FOUO, or there would be restrictions, unclassified FOUO, but then we would still get restrictions on sharing it with our international locations. It just became really, really cumbersome. And every time, the government gets involved so far in this space, it's been really bad. And I'm looking for that shift based on what Jack's saying to something that's at least progress neutral and not detrimental.
So, and I actually fully and completely agree with you. So one of the some of the optimism I have isn't that the entire federal government's perspective is going to shift. It is, in fact, the federal government. They specialize in exactly the type of thing you just said. That, however, we have, because I'm not in government anymore, and one of the things we as EnergySec, advocate as often as we can to the people in the electric community that we work with is you have an opportunity in the mechanisms that the executive order describes and the processes in which they'll be engaged to take that initiative away. It's the culture and the personality of the government may make it difficult to do so, but the structures and the mechanisms that are putting in place are ostensibly designed to allow industry to take that initiative and to have that control over the conversation. It is, in my opinion, it's up to us to get together, to use what is being provided to our own advantage, and to come up with good solutions. One of the things I've been working on, the past year or more, is working on kind of a risk assessment, a national level business-driven risk assessment for one of the critical infrastructure industries. And one of the selling points of that is that it allows the industry to provide a common view to government of what its priorities are, what its concerns are, and what its risks are. It's been so far, if you ask what cybersecurity is or what concerns are from industry or from anybody, you have 1,000 different answers. You don't have a single voice, and you get a lot of rhetoric, you get a lot of, the sky is falling, you get a lot of, hey, there's nothing wrong whatsoever. So, some of the mechanisms, some of this process is designed, and whether or not, the culture in the government will do that by default almost doesn't matter. As long as industry takes advantage of it, is designed to achieve consensus. Take advantage of it is my advice. It's not something. It's one, and that's the dramatic change that I like in the executive order. That it's with these structures, if handled right by industry, I think we have the collective opportunity to create enough, force through consensus to be able to direct the dialogue using some of the mechanisms in the executive order. I don't know that will happen. It's a complicated world, and you're right about the inertia of the federal government culture. It's by and large, exactly as you described it.
It does give people a bullet point on a document to point to, however, and stand their case with, and that's a good first start. I mean, likewise, the information sharing is now really becoming part of the active dialogue everywhere. I mean, this has been an axe I've been grinding for a couple of years, and I keep coming back to the point of, when the private sector refuses to, then the government has to step in to force it, and we'll always do it in a poorer fashion than the private sector could do if it got it together itself. But of course they haven't. They haven't. So at least this is now actively on the table for every org out there that's listening to the news finally. And so small victories. But I think one of the things I was talking about this last week and everything is getting stuff going is good. The thing I keep coming back around to is I'm to the point almost where I've stopped really caring about wanting to secure anything and wanting to just make this a better industry to work in. I keep talking about pushing people out, the InfoSec brain drain. Eventually, all builds like this include little notes of, oh yes, we're going to have 5,000 more security people in seats by next year and everything. That's as good as saying we're going to have 5,000 more doctors by next month. I mean, good security people take a good decade to create, at least. Experience is so much part of it and everything. And as we go from being a craft to a trade, I mean, certainly I think I'm one of that last bit of the generation that got into this because it interested in us, not because, hey, that's a good career opportunity. And like I say, there's a lot of us figuring out how to get out of this business. Is there anything you reckon that can actually be meaningfully done at the government level to sort of really encourage meaningful security trade education and keeping people wanting to be in the business beyond our rather high burnout rate?
Can I partially respond to that before handing it to you, Jack?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I'm going to say, if I was to answer Conrad, I would say absolutely nothing government could do to help us, because government creates the glass ceiling for everything that any of us need to do as an industry. That's all they do, and the function of government is really that, at least government as it's envisioned by our founding fathers and in the United States. Maybe it's different in other countries, namely the way, say, the Chinese look at it, and there's all those debates about go versus chess and managed socialism versus this quasi-social capitalism, whatever you want to call it, that's going on in the U.S. right now. I'm going to say no. That would be my absolute answer. I don't want the government trying to tell us any more about how to develop our industry, because what they've done is they've anointed, through trying to tell us where to go with our industry, they've anointed expertise and to political staffers who then anointed it to C-levels at key companies that have gotten contracts, who then anointed it to their senior researcher through a blog post or through an op-ed. And while many of these people are, in some cases, quite talented, for the most part, it's the ones who get out there and do more of the talking and more of the PR that get the attention and set the baseline from government's perspective as to expertise. And that really, I'll hand it over to Jack, that really is where my answer would be, is there's absolutely nothing government can do to help us in this space in terms of developing industry expertise.
So I have three kind of just distinct responses to that. The first is immediately, right now the government is really not telling. It is, at least the order, and I'm going to keep it to the order here, is, and the subsequent messaging officially, whether or not you've run into individuals who haven't gotten the message yet is kind of a different question. But the messaging is, we're not going to tell you anything. We are here to help you work together. We're here to help solve the problem. We're not going to tell you anything. Whether or not that actually comes to pass, I have no idea. I'm as skeptical as anybody. But nonetheless, that is the messaging, and those are the words. Second, I'm going to be a little bit more philosophical about it. I don't care, really, if the InfoSec community gets better right now. Because the InfoSec community, in my mind, is not where the problem is. We're not suffering because we don't have enough people who can't do intrusion detection. We're not suffering because we don't have enough people who can do malware analysis. We're not suffering because we have not enough people who can do vulnerability assessments or router configurations. We are suffering because we have those people who are not in the information security community, who are not contributing their part, who are not aware that they have a part to play. We're talking executives. We're talking about procurement officials. We're talking about DBAs, users, vendors, salespeople, really just about anybody else who touches a keyboard. There's 98% of the people who affect your network security state at any given moment in time are not on board with this yet. And so honestly, the InfoSec community is doing, it may be terrible. We may be losing people by the tons, but honestly, that's in my mind probably a different topic of conversation and large, but we're not failing because we don't do InfoSec, core SME stuff well. We're failing because the rest of the culture and the rest of the knowledge isn't there outside of our core community. So that's kind of a side thing, and that's my personal opinion. From a government perspective, let me give you an example of something that has worked. I talked about the risk assessment thing that I worked on as a Fed and that I still facilitate through EnergySec. We got 50 critical infrastructure companies from one industry to participate in this project. That's 50 of probably the top 100 in the industry. With I think it's 70 people call into their first call, and we're still at probably 30 or 40 per call, at least when we ask them to participate. And the perspective from the government at that point was, hey guys, we need to understand, we need you to create a consensus point of view so that you can better communicate with us and that you can better understand your risk. We came to the table, we said, hey, we have some ideas about how your space works, but honestly, you're the experts, not us. So the intent of the process was to work through and have them say, you guys as the government, you're morons. You don't know our space. You don't know industry. Here's how it really works. And so we're about halfway through that process, and it's been a phenomenal success so far. The industry we lead, and this is what I think the government's role should be. We lead the facilitation. We get the people to the table. We provide guidance on, how this stuff should all fit together, especially at a large scale outside of individual companies. And we provide, we bridge some of the conversations between individual companies. We're support in a way. We're almost glorified admin staff. Our job is to make sure it gets done, but not necessarily how it gets done, and especially not responsible for the content. So there are things going on that don't necessarily get the news. A lot of the cool, sexy, instant response stuff, like the certs, or when the government comes in and steps in and makes a mess of things, that makes the news. But a lot of the stuff that's going on, people just don't talk about. They're allergic to public attention. There's been a number of cases where the media takes things out of context, and it results in either higher incorrect congressional awareness and ends up in regulation, or ends up with that industry getting burned for 10 years because some reporter or somebody else didn't take the time to actually look at the larger context. So some of the good work that's actually going on isn't necessarily very well known, and that's a larger cultural problem that's probably outside of the scope of this conversation. But I guess I just want to say that in some cases it is working, and that there is a role, in my opinion, for the government, and that it's facilitative. It's to get different parties together and to solve some of especially when we're talking about competitive collaboration, right? Industry isn't, they're competitors, close competitors in some cases. And so there needs to be a third party. There needs to be a third and fourth party in some cases to help bridge those gaps and make sure some of the stuff gets done, even if they're not the source of the information, even if they're not directing.
I'm sure it's certainly
I want to frame this slightly differently then for Conrad here. I gave my opinion on what I think government should be doing. Now, Conrad, representing one of the more peer-recognized security research firms out there that isn't in the paper every other day. I'd be interested to hear what Conrad's perspective on what, if it was up to him, what he would like to see as an industry member come out as a result of the executive order over the next few years to the industry.
Ooh. Trying to give you an answer to that without getting into my grand vision, which does involve a technology component. I've been thinking about this a lot, and to cut a lot of the other stuff out of the way, I think the perfect vision of where this ends up, and this does sort of involve a technology component, is the kind of and I'm conjecturing here, but the kind of intelligence stuff you actually have going on in, name your three-letter intelligence agency here, collaboratively, distributively built amongst the private sector, without having to set everything up as a point-to-point circuit switched data exchange, but proper packet-based, et cetera, et cetera. I almost have to say in the cloud here. But this idea that we're still getting to the point of we've got to set up these individual data exchange, information sharing arrangements, munge data, establish standards and everything. I think there's an information technology way to address this, as have been addressed in far cooler but more trivial things out there and everything. There's a lot of technology out there that's being used for very I say trivial but more fun uses that we really need to start looking at how we can map over to the security side and everything. For a field that calls itself information security, we spend a lot of time going through data and very little time actually dealing with information. So, to give you an idea, the whole Alienvault Open Thread Exchange is a primitive first step towards that. But it is just that, just a big crowdsourced repository of, hey, we've seen these things from these people. Everyone else contributing to it goes, oh yeah, we have too. And then as patterns start emerging, they get thrown back into reputation data, back to people subscribing and everything. So no one's data is really attached to them. It's all weighted out between all the people using it. And so for us, it's just the more people we have subscribe to Open Thread Exchange, the more data we have, the more accurate it becomes. Yes, it's obviously starts off with a lot of the low-hanging fruit and everything, but there are ways you can start slicing that interestingly that we're looking out into the next year or so. But that's getting into product stuff. So much information sharing right now is in one of two formats. It's either reputation data, which, as we know, is pretty transient and meaningless. IP addresses and everything can change owner from one day to the next. And the other is anecdotal. When it comes down to, again, we got to use the new buzzword of the last year, attribution. That's the stuff that people hide behind closed doors, determined as their secret source and everything else. I mean, certainly last year, I had to call out Kevin Mandia to his face when he sat in front of an audience of us at B-Sides telling us, oh yes, we need to go and share more information with each other. I'm just sitting there going, that's really interesting from a company that goes out of its way to monetize that transaction at every step. I mean, granted, you're a business, and pretty much runs on the operation of, well, we know things you don't know, so just take our word for it and trust us. That idea of transparency without giving away things that are of value to you is a tough one to crack. I mean, Kevin did say in response something I think is absolutely spot on the nose. There's a lot of intelligence that the more widely it's available, the less value it actually has. In the same measure as I was responding to Jarno Lindell's article on InfoSec Island a couple of months ago and everything, we don't need to really talk in terms of cyber war when we have the language of espionage, and one of the best ways to neutralize a secret agent is to make them no longer secret. Outing their identities goes a long way to reducing their ability to operate. Skipping ahead a bit and everything, that's sort of what I was interested about, Mandy dropping off their China attribution this morning and everything. That kind of thing where you're putting names and faces to stuff, that's the kind of hacking back that actually has a material effect on people. And if we can evolve to the point where we can kind of crowdsource that, again, attribution to stuff, where it's very difficult for people to act covertly and without being identified, because essentially that their actions are being cross-checked automatically between their various victims. Insert security or automobile metaphor here and everything, but that idea of keeping ahead of them informationally wise and, riding a horse, riding from a horse on village to village, shouting, "The British are coming, the British are coming." That's the kind of thing that actually may have a serious material effect out of things.
Now, all right, you kind of led me into shifting gears here, and I do want to shift gears a little bit on two aspects. One is that whether the executive order, and I shouldn't say whether, the executive order in the text itself referred to Department of Homeland Security, privacy matters, consumer matters, and had a lot of subtext that definitely read like it was referring to CISPA. All right, and I do want to touch on that here in a second. The other aspect is that in the actual State of the Union address and other press corps events around the State of the Union address, which the executive order was unveiled for that day, was a lot of talk about China, which has been a topic of endless conversation and debate. And to both of you, and whoever takes this first, I don't mind, I'd like some commentary on why is CISPA at all being even inferred to, or especially after last year's debacle, in anything coming out of POTUS in the executive order, and is that meaningful? Is there a place for the heart of CISPA? And the issues about China, is China specifically worth talking about? Because, and a little bit to Conrad's point, that when you call out the people individually, this isn't the first time, it's actually been done, at least in semi-open doors, specifically faculty and staff at major Chinese universities, individuals working in various capacities within Chinese government as malware authors, very specifically been called out, and nothing has ever happened. It hasn't hurt those people or dissuaded them from participating, in the very least in part because of the way the Chinese government is structured. So from the executive order, the question to both you two is, what is CISPA's role to play, if any, and was it necessary for it to be kind of tied in anyway into the executive order, which it was in the undercurrent, and what is China's relation to the executive order and our forward-moving path? So either one of you who wants to jump.
I'd like to take that actually, and then I'd like to go back right after that briefly to the previous commentary. With regard to the politicization of the executive order is clearly there. What I think, and this is I have no inside knowledge of this. What I think is happening is you see a bunch of smart people who actually know what's going on put together basically what the executive order is, and then it's being potentially used for political purposes as well. I think we should divorce, conversationally at least, the uses to which the executive order is put from a political standpoint to the value contained within what it is. I suspect you have a whole bunch of people who know what they're talking about who helped inform the executive order. It is now a token to be used for other potential objectives. With CISPA, I have no comment because it's such a complicated topic on whether it's good or bad from a privacy standpoint, et cetera. But I will say that my reading of it is that the language in there is familiar from the public-private partnership dialogue I've heard. So whether it's a good or a bad bill, it does things and requests things that an executive order just can't do. That's one of the reasons the executive order speaks directly to what the government can do, because that's what an executive order can do. When you start talking about legislation, that begins to change legal frameworks that executive order cannot legally do. And so if, assuming you agree with the motivations and the roles and the purpose of CISPA, yes, it is in fact still needed in addition to the executive order because it changes legal perspectives. The executive order just directs agencies to do things that are technically already their responsibilities anyway. China's a political motivation for sure. I don't really have much other comment on that specifically. My one comment about the previous talk about information sharing, and is that it's really important. It's what my organization focuses on. But there's one of the things that we really, really need to focus on is reduction of error rate. Cybersecurity is a quality assurance problem, and we can do all the information sharing in the world, but if we keep making the same mistakes in the same volume, at the same rate per day that we're making them, as we add computers to the mix, as we add complexities to the mix, the actual number of mistakes we make per day is going to escalate. The number of things we have to remediate will escalate. And basically we'll be, over time, whether we're out-resourced now or later, we will be out-resourced. So one of the changes with the executive order that I really, really appreciated seeing is a shift from, hey, we're going to fix things based on what we know today, to, if not explicitly, and maybe the people who wrote it aren't even aware that they've done it, but there's more potential for reducing the rate at which we make errors when it comes to cybersecurity, the rate at which we make vulnerabilities, the rate at which we make poor decisions. And so it's that reduction in error rate that I think is such a positive thing.
Yeah, I mean, that ties back to that whole talent doesn't scale thing I was talking about before. I mean, we have to make doing the process of security more effective, because we can't create more security geniuses overnight. We have to do a better job of doing it day to day.
All right, guys. Sorry, I'm trying to juggle the mute a little bit to cut out background noise for some listener feedback. So sorry, Jack, I cut you out there again for a second. Conrad, do you have any other feelings on the CISPA aspects of things, the privacy aspects of things? Jack didn't, for obvious reasons, not obvious reasons. I mean, Jack he said if you believe that we need something like CISPA, then you still need it because the executive order doesn't really do it. But he wouldn't comment on the cognitive value of it, so to speak. Do you have any of your own feelings on the value of CISPA?
This ties into, let's back up a bit. I think one of the worst things for many of us working in information security, and especially the way it's worked as it has become, more of an impendingly impactful nature of life in the modern world, is that it means we end up being party to things we're philosophically opposed to. What happened to all of us back in the early 90s when we were talking about information wants to be free? Now most of us spend our day jobs trying to keep other people's secrets. So, when things like CISPA come along and I see people I've worked for putting their signature of approval on it, it kind of makes me wonder, where I went wrong in trying to educate up the management chain a little. It's always been the desire of anyone in a state-based or authority position to have as much information as possible just in case they need it. I mean, I have a patent application in the process right now that is, I pretty much described it as the most dangerous idea I'd had in the last couple of years. So by putting it in for a patent process, hopefully that would mean it would never get used. At the same time, I came up with the idea because it would have made my job a lot easier. It would have also been insanely intrusive. I would have loved to have built it at the same time if any employee, the company I've worked for, had ever asked me what it did. I would have had to sort of look at them very, very guiltily and say, well, it tells me far more about you and your personal life than I should have reason to know. But I'm doing it for your own good and the company's good. So, hey, trust me, I'm not doing anything bad with it. Welcome to CISPA, SOPA, and everything else. It keeps coming back round to that idea that you want access to the information, you want it lying around just in case. I mean, as it's been so often repeated in the last couple of years with a little more transparency, whistleblowing, et cetera, into the National Security Agency, that, hey, yeah, the NSA pretty much does record everything. Do they have the desire or manpower to look at it all? Hell no, they don't. But if something leads them to where they want that info, they want it available and everything. You can put in safeguards and everything, but safeguards are only as good as the people that obey them, pretty much. All technical safeguards are only as good as the people that actually implement them. If they forget to implement them, well, what good is it? So, yeah, we're rocking a hard place and everything. I mean, I think there are 1,001 people in InfoSec out there that have been brought in front of their management chain and said, been asked, so what do we do about this threat from Anonymous? And we've all had to sit around and go, well, wow, you're full of yourself. So you're telling me you're that evil that Anonymous is a threat to you? Or the other end is, well, I don't know. Do you want me to go ask? I think a lot of us have had that conversation and wondered, well, what's the correct answer here? I think it is possible to do some of these things properly. The issue comes back to, and as you touched on here and everything, that no form of government paperwork can exist without something else earmarked alongside it and everything. And I just can't see something effective in terms of enforcing that kind of record-keeping, information sharing while still maintaining anonymity and privacy being worthwhile to be implemented at the government level. I almost think that sort of has to be done at the corporate level, because the competition between companies sort of acts in favor of individual privacy in some regards until, that's at least limited by specific engagements. No one wants to give away all their customers' information to everyone else. They might sell it to a couple of people individually, But giving it away as part of info sharing is never going to happen. Whereas things like CISPA sort of roll that all into one. That makes sense.
To me it does. It makes sense. You know, what you're saying makes sense to me. Now we've hit the 1 hour mark, and I do want to, unless you guys need to drop off, there were a couple other things I kind of wanted to hit on.
Before you hit on it, I have a couple of brief things to say. To go back to my non-comment, I will add that as a Fed, the number one thing that people told me when we asked how can we help instead of, hey, we're here to help, is we don't have the information at the end of the classified rainbow. We don't have information sharing. So if CISPA is coming, and if you don't like it, be aware that the requirement for CISPA, the perception of a requirement for CISPA, largely, in my opinion, came from industry who have been engaged in the process so far. So this is not something that Congress just randomly thought of. This has been over and over again a reason for why cybersecurity has not been successful, and it's been we don't have the right information, we can't share information amongst ourselves, and you guys have all of this gold at the end of the rainbow that you're not sharing to us. So if we're not happy with it as private industry, well, that's kind of on us, in my opinion.
Well, all right, I'm going to let I'll let Conrad chime in on that in a second, but I have to. This is a pet peeve of mine. This is part of the evolution I was speaking about earlier. Is private industry was doing fine talking to each other, at least in my sectors of defense, was doing fine talking to each other until the government kept telling us we're doing it wrong because incidents are still happening. And C-levels really bought into that. C-levels really bought into the idea that because incidents were still happening, that we were doing it wrong. And the incidents were happening from a nation state, and thus we needed a nation state response to those incidents. So I think this is a perception when you say private industry went up to the government. I think this is something that the government reinforced for years under the false premise that they were doing it right in the first place. And I think that's part of the problem here is now everybody's like, well, if you keep telling us we do it wrong, what incentive do we have to actually try to go out there and do anything better? Because no matter what we do, it's not good enough. And it's kind of like, the child being punished repeatedly. And that's part of my big problem with this is I understand what you're saying, Jack, that a lot of industries really pushing for CISPA, portions of CISPA at least. But at the same time, I don't think they're doing that without a really, really aggressive, sharp, pointy stick in their back after years and years and years where they're getting punished over and over and over again by government in, behind closed doors.
I won't argue with that even a little bit. One of the things I think would be helpful is if everybody gets together and comes up with, and one of the reasons I'm really glad you did this particular event with us is to have the various different historic perspectives to see how we ended up in this conversation. Because I think a lot of people are talking, past each other based on their own, based on the different histories that have actually happened and not been tied together. So, again, agree with you.
So Conrad, I'm sorry, I cut you off there a few minutes ago. Go right ahead.
No, I was saying it's like the requirements may have come from the private sector, but requirements and implementation are two very different beasts, and the devil is in the implementation. But the mention of history and everything, and nation states, etc., and that this kind of drags up to the Mandiant report as well and everything. At what point did we get this idea that writing a simple rat tool required a nation state to do? I mean, I really have to see evidence of anything whatsoever out there that required a government to achieve in terms of breaching any network. Now, even Stuxnet, not outside of the range of possibility of an organization and everything. The whole China thing, China's been breaking into systems for decades. Like, what was the watershed for us for us really getting into this, you know, national level actor being part of the discourse for simple programming?
I'll have a comment on that.
I think. Go ahead, Jack. Go right ahead.
Just quick, and then over to you. I mean, really, one of the things driving this is that as we add control systems to networks, the entire potential scope, whether or not they're committing espionage or more, is beside the point. As we connect control systems, as we have the potential for kinetic consequence, the perception of risk increases. The reality of risk, honestly, increases. A lot of, when you look at some of the espionage campaigns, you have if not actual kinetic attempts, you have the potential access. You have the access to potentially do it, and so the actual level of consequence over time has increased. So in the past, China's been doing this forever. You're exactly right. But if they chose to behave differently, if anyone chooses to behave differently, the risk to the United States has actually increased over time. Therefore, the rhetoric and the pace and the peak of the dialogue has obviously increased as well. Just my initial response to that.
Well, the thing is, you know, if I was responding to Conrad, or I am responding to Conrad, I think part of the problem isn't that a nation state is required to do any of these attacks. We know that a nation state isn't required to do these attacks, but that's communicated poorly from government circles, and the result is that people actually believe that a nation state is required to commit these attacks, and that creates this impression that a nation state is required to respond to the attacks. And I think this is a Cold War mentality and a nuclear mentality that, you know, Russian nuclear arms, you got to deal with it at the Department of Defense level with mutually assured destruction and nuclear armament buildup at the nation state level. And that perception is continuously, daily reinforced. And I think a better way the government could help, if they wanted to, and I think the government actually prefers that, frankly, because government, you know, it's an expansion of powers and funding and everything between government and the private industry that's part of this, you know, new cyber-industrial complex that's forming. But I think a government would be well served, in our economy in the U.S. and in Western countries would be well served if government said that, look, a majority of the threats, even though we're telling you they're being executed by the Chinese nation state or by sponsorship by the Chinese nation state, a majority of these threats can be executed on any college campus, anywhere in the world. It really isn't this big of a deal because the shape of our cyber responses and our cyber security defense posture, but that's horrible phrasing on my part, but the shape, the condition of our defensive posture is so bad that anybody can do it. But right now we're just telling you the people who are doing it the most are the Chinese, and I'm not even convinced that's necessarily the case. But they could phrase it differently, and they don't, and I think part of that is deliberate. And the part of that, not part of that, I think a majority of that's deliberate, and the part of it that's causing this problem right now is that China, unlike Russia, China also happens to be our economic hope moving forward too. I mean, they're really our largest untapped market. We're so intricately tied into China between debt and manufacturing and untapped market space. The tie is so tight that, unlike the Russian, you know, specter of threat in the nuclear and the Cold War, the damage to our economy by putting China up as this big boogeyman could be a lot worse than anything that was going on with Russia for 5.5 decades.
But that's that Cold War comparison. I mean, this is what I keep talking about, you know, infosec brain drain and everything. The more we go down this path, the more I feel like a atomic scientist in the 60s. I mean, I'm no pacifist, but the way things are running, I just feel more and more of a moral compulsion to get out of being part of the problem in some ways. You know what I mean? At the same time, the more I try to get out of info security, the more I realize that this is possibly the best place to make a dent in the universe on the world today.
You know, I completely agree with you guys. We don't have generally defensible systems, and that's a problem. Nobody really wants to talk about the utter and complete failure of current InfoSec architectures to combat reasonably equipped anybody. You know, to your point, it could happen from anywhere. There's nothing special. The only thing that makes really China nation states particularly special is the funding and the maturation required to assure success, basically. The actual vulnerabilities are the same. They don't exploit anything particularly different from anybody else. It's really the same stuff. So, you know, from my perspective, there's a counterintel. There's a government perspective that's unique to China and Russia and nation-state actors. But the controls, the requirements to actually resolve things aren't specific. And this is why, you know, I think information sharing is important. We do it all the time. But, you know, one of the reasons people ask for information sharing is because the doors and the windows aren't locked and it's not under their control. If I'm a security guard in a building, and I'm tasked with defending the building and keeping, you know, bad people out, but my management has the control over which doors are locked, which windows are locked, where people can come in, the first thing I'm going to do is complain, hey, I need more information, and I'm going to make it out to be and it's going to be a big deal. We need to focus less on who's coming at us and just doing the basics. Not only just doing the basics, but doing the basics consistently. It's not like we don't know what we should be doing, which is a perception that seems to be going on. We actually know technically how to secure our systems. But what I think one of the unsolved problems is how to do it consistently over time. You know, all of the major players who have been compromised recently knew better. RSA, Google, all those guys, they know better. And so the problem isn't, hey, nation states have some super high-tech way of getting in. The problem is we can't consistently apply controls over time with enough fidelity that allows, you know, the basic, the norm attack architecture to not succeed against us. And that has nothing to do with China, that has nothing to do with nation states, and that has nothing to do with governments. So, you know, agreeing with you guys a little bit here, completely, actually.
And when you say that, I mean, let's roll this back round into the attribution thing as the current hot buzzword. As someone's done a lot of incident response and everything else, I do actually have attribution as part of, like, you know, my general methodology. You're right. The whole, you know, who exactly is this? For most folks has limited value. Communally, it does. Attribution, though, is good as a workload reduction method by being able to go, hey, these supposedly unrelated things we're seeing here are part of the same grouped action. As a way for us to do more with less and be more effective in terms of investigation, response, and detection, attribution is a good technique here, in so much as grouping things together, root cause analysis. That root cause happens to be a human being or a bunch of them, but for most people, their identity isn't relevant.
So I want to highlight something that's and then actually Jack probably is best suited to respond to this. I want to highlight something that is frequently confused when it comes from either me or Scott, who, again, unfortunately, Scott wasn't able to join us. Nobody is saying that there can't be a catastrophic attack against our industrial infrastructure through cyber means. What we're saying when we respond to things like 747s falling out of the sky or power stations blowing up is that the threat is exaggerated by who can actually commit the threat and what the implications are. If it's not trivial to get a successful, reliable, repeatable exploit to work on in all these various environments without the nation-state type support that Jack was referring to. So when people say, like Craig Wright had come out last year with an article about, with a little blurb about the 747 unit controls that, that people took to mean the 747 and engine controls are going to just fall out of the sky, it doesn't really work that way in actual operational capacity. It just doesn't.
Can I give you an example I've actually taken very seriously? And I will admit, I admit this is one I consider like a real threat. And, well, let's put it this way. On December the 11th, 12th, and 13th, 2001, I spent those 3 days about 5 stories underground under an old Cold War built telephone central office. Telecom world, a central office is where the switching's done, not where the people sit at desks. Basically, because we were quite seriously considering a follow-up attack on the digital end of stuff. And on April 1st, Configure April 1st, I informed our corporate security people that the physical space folks just basically be on alert. Wild guess, but there may actually be something in your realm that shows up on the same day. As an impact magnifier, I think a lot of the cyber threats are quite legit. On 9/11, we were basically running at about 300% of capacity of the phone network for like the next 48 hours. Literally, it was because the entire nation was talking. We were one of the phone companies. We were struggling to keep the actual communication networks up. It's probably no surprise that I'm another of those ham radio guys, because I've seen quite well that communication networks are made with duct tape and baling wire and can fail at a moment's notice. So if you tell me, hey, something kinetic in conjunction with an attack on command and control communication systems and everything, I wouldn't argue that at all. But on its own, and this is the thing, it's always pitched as, oh yes, it's just going to be the solely digital attack that will turn all the lights off, mass panic, etc., etc. Our systems are kind of made with duct tape and baling wire, but the people running them aren't, unless there's already something reducing their operational capacity, like 747s falling out of the sky. So that's basically my take on it. And that's one that I have taken seriously the couple of times I've run into it as a possibility. So it's not to say that it's impossible. It's just that there is a larger picture to look into in the way how society and society's response to crises occur.
Yeah, and you absolutely nailed it. And I think this is one space which I think all three of us, based on my prior readings of Jack's tweets and work, I think this is one space we can agree on. You absolutely nailed it. The threat doesn't come in and of itself as a one-off event or even one major cyber event. The threat is that it's going to come with it's going to cause kinetic effects, but it's going to come with some other geopolitical and kinetic context that is more meaningful, and that things like attribution kind of go out of the window. Because right now, a lot of the talk about attribution is moot when somebody actually goes on cyber war, because it's not going to come with nobody's going to launch a cyber war. Iran's not going to launch a cyber war against the U.S. by attacking one power station. That's just not what's going to happen.
Sure.
And the response, and they won't do that in part because the response will be similar to how we deal with natural disasters. The people aren't going to fall apart. They're going to go throw the levers, and they're going to go take care of stuff. It's going to happen as a part of a larger context. And that's part of the reason I've always said for years now that attribution issues in cyber are way overblown. Because if you're so worried about who's doing it, then you're adding a geopolitical context to a technical problem you have. So you're not solving the technical problem. You're trying to solve a person or geopolitical problem that you're just never going to be able to solve. Conrad, you just absolutely nailed it. That's exactly how I feel, and based on Jack's prior work, I'm pretty sure that's exactly how he feels.
Again, this all comes around to, like, why do we need to context things in a language where we already have it for? Cyber war is not war. Espionage, sabotage, yes. Are those things useful within the context of war? Absolutely, they are. Are they war in and of themselves? No, not at all.
No, but there's. I largely agree with you guys. I just want to finesse this a little bit. From an attribution standpoint, attribution, as he said, can be helpful, in aggregating the information, as long as we have the information systems, we have the techniques and process to respond, assuming we have the attribution. Right now, for the most part, assuming we have the attribution, we don't really have the mechanisms in place to effectively respond. But more to the point of the current part of the conversation, there are a couple of perspectives when cyber really plays a part in quote cyber war. Again, it's I agree. It's never going to be one thing, but there's times where it's going to be important. One is, if you guys are familiar with how nerve gas is typically intended to be used as opposed to terrorism. For example, VX is intended to be used as a blocking agent. It's a territory denial system. So when you start looking at cybersecurity, if people have backdoored our entire energy infrastructure, they may never actually knock out our power grid. They probably will never need to. The threat of being able to cause some sort of widespread damage is more to the point than the actual causing of the damage. So our perception that we have, and power grids is probably a bad example since I work in that space. So let's say our space-based transportation industry, if that was completely backdoored by a foreign country, then that limits our potential response options. That limits our ability to maneuver. And so from a war perspective, we might, when we look at Chinese espionage, when we look at other espionage going on, they're stealing data, but they also have position. They also have a position from which to operate. The persistent part is important. So if we ever do go to a kinetic war and they're all over our space-based transportation system, then we have to wonder what capabilities they have in that space. And two, I've heard from a number of sources that doctrinally some other countries look at attribution as a way to delay our command response. In other words, if we were to actually go to war, if there's a large series of events, attribution is useful especially in Western powers, delaying or confusing our approach and our response to activity. So it's a fog of war. It can potentially be used as a fog of war mechanism intentionally, which I'm not a war expert, but that seems like an interesting possibility to me.
Yeah, but again, this comes back around to exactly this point: sabotage and espionage, tools of war, not war in and of themselves.
Yeah, absolutely, and espionage in and of itself. Espionage has been a way of life in a number of these cultures and including our own in the U.S. for centuries. People ask me, and I'm sure you guys get asked the same question. Who are the most clever in the cyber espionage space? And in terms of clever, at least from my perspective, China. I almost always mention China only because people are expecting it to be mentioned. There's a really, really explicit and more interesting history with the Soviets, the French, the Japanese, the United Kingdom even, and what was being done, the industrial nature of it, because China this huge sucking sound coming from China doesn't, nowadays it does, but it didn't for a long time tie in to government or industrial growth in China. It was just they were sucking so much data because they could, whereas some other players, there's a notable case with the French and the Japanese and the tilt-rotor aircraft like the Osprey. They were doing things very specifically and explicitly and completely to concentrate on just that industrial capacity or that military capacity, like the Russians did before it. And China's definitely going to become a victim of that too with emerging markets like what's happening in Myanmar. These emergent markets are coming, and the low-hanging fruit for them to suck and build up their low-end industrial capacity is going to come from China. It's not going to come from the U.S. anymore. But all those are acts of espionage. I mean, these aren't cyber war. And I don't think you're going to see anything unless something really dramatic happens, say over Taiwan, that approaches anything that I would call cyber war with China. Now, Iran or North Korea is a different story, but I don't think you're going to have the attribution problems and the fog of cyber attribution that you necessarily have with China today.
And that's definitely sort of my thought on it as well. In fact, if you want a statement from me that is probably going to make me a person of suspicion and possibly get my employer's customers all going, wait, what? Is that on the big picture, long-term, species level, really, what's the problem with China stealing a bunch of research and info and everything else? Who knows? Maybe they might actually do something more beneficial to mankind with it. Speaking long-term here and everything. There's certain stuff there's certain stuff that is worth protecting in the short term and everything, but again, that idea of this becoming yet another progress-inhibiting Cold War is kind of ridiculous. And
it's not an existential threat. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've spent, since the Cold War, for whatever reason, or even during the later stages of the Cold War, we've built this concept of intellectual property, and we've built this complex of intellectual property obesity on top of our new, our evolving concepts of IP. People have forgotten how to compete. And I don't think, if this wasn't being done via computers, I don't think anybody would really care. I really think it has something to do with people, imagining their Facebook profiles being read by the Chinese more than it does with the IP loss itself. I don't know what happened to us as a culture.
And on the other hand, we're so sick of hearing cyber war, digital Pearl Harbor, clear and present danger, et cetera, that the actual. I completely agree. The very real message that yes, our information systems are evolving. They're becoming more intrinsic to literally how modern societies continue to operate day to day. They are vulnerable. They are not as robust as most people imagine. They can be interfered with potentially catastrophically. The problem is that half the people pushing this message are basically war profiteers. Without naming any of the usual suspects, I have a real hard time accepting someone crying wolf from the mountain that our computers are all going to explode and kill us all, when that person has 3 books on the matter declaring himself the expert on the subject.
Now, in about 1:30, the live feed is going to cut off for people. So I'm going to hand it over to, Jack first, kind of make any closing statements. You don't have to rush through it because everything will be recorded and in the archive that will go up after a few minutes after the show. But just in case we cut off live, folks, don't worry. Everything will be preserved, and you can play it back at the main site there. So, any closing thoughts, Jack?
Yeah, sure. So, the closing thoughts, I'll kind of sum up my perspective. Stuff's been happening before with cybersecurity and in the government and with kind of all hazards protections. So if you really want to understand what's happening, take a look at stuff like the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, HSPD 7. Figure out what a sector-specific agency is, a sector coordinating council, a government coordinating council, those types of things. If you really want to understand the current dialogue, look at what's actually on the books in the past, and then you can maybe understand how the executive order has changed it. The new one, it begins to provide a more of a structured approach to deriving kind of good performance-based results. It attempts to get business leaders and the rest of everybody else involved. It tries to drive their future state.
the value of the framework is there so that we can help to reason through the problem. We have an opportunity as the government shifts its perspectives to get involved and actually take ownership back from the government. When it comes to attribution and China and all that, the espionage stuff doesn't concern me, but the positioning, the ability of people to reach certain points in our infrastructure for whatever purpose, even if the current purpose is espionage, they can get pretty far in, and they can get to positions where potential kinetic damage could occur. That should be concerning. And so even if we're not really worried about the particular espionage, we should take a strong look at, what the potential consequences are of what we're doing. Lastly, I honestly believe what we've been doing collectively has been insufficient. It's not meeting a minimum standard to keep people out. As we've said, almost anybody can get in, depending on the level. It's just the sustainability that differs with nation states. So we need to take a hard look at how we're architecting and assuring quality control in our systems over time.
Beautiful. And Conrad, any closing thoughts on your part?
I think he's got essentially to write one of the truths there. When it comes down to it, security is a subset of reliability, durability. I keep making mention of how so much of our systems are held together with duct tape, baling wire, and hard work from dutiful humans. So, if we look at it that these systems are becoming more and more intrinsic to keeping our society running, we have a responsibility to make them more durable, more reliable, and security is a vital part of that. Then we're back on the noble cause here, and that's really something I think we've all been looking for a while, the last couple of years.
Beautiful, and I really want to thank both of you, both Jack and Conrad here. It was huge. The feedback on the chat channel and through Twitter has been great. I really, really appreciate you both taking such a huge chunk of your time. I know everybody is real busy, and Andrew Lee last week or 2 weeks ago, from ESET on the antivirus industry was another good one. So I really, really appreciate this collective response from everybody on these issues. And definitely check out Conrad's work coming. He's got some stuff going on at B-Side San Francisco. Jack's going to be presenting at Source Boston on the wider topic issue. So definitely check these guys out. And again, guys, I really appreciate it. So this will be Cloak and Swagger signing off. And thanks a lot, everybody.
Hey, thank you.
Enjoyed every minute of it.
All right, guys. Y'all take care, and thank you, listeners, for hanging in there with us.